Very good. I have with us today Bernard Huot, who has graciously agreed to be interviewed for part of our project. I welcome you today, Bernard. It's an honor and a privilege to interview you today.
Thank you.
I'd like to start off with some background questions for context. So I'd like to start off by asking you, where were your parents born?
My dad was born in St. Boniface, Manitoba. My mother was born in Huot, Quebec. And that in itself is interesting because my father's family left Quebec in the mid-1800s to settle in the Red River Colony. They became very good friends with Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont. In fact, my great-grandparents are buried only a couple of plots away from both Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont in Manitoba, in the St. Boniface Cathedral Cemetery. For my mom, this is where my Anglophone side comes in. My mom, born and raised in Huot, Quebec, comes from an Indigenous father and an Irish mother who met after the First War in what is today Wendake, just outside of Quebec City. They moved from Wendake, or Ancienne Lorette, as it was called at the time, to Huot to work for the Brown Pulp and Paper Mill, which is today Canadian International Paper. I myself am born in Rouyn-Noranda. Today, I believe it's only referred to as Rouen after the amalgamation and the fusions took place almost 15 years ago. I didn't stay there long. My parents quickly decided to pack up and move to greener pastures, and that led us to Quebec City.
Okay. Now, where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, and any post-secondary?
My elementary education began in the Protestant system at the time in Quebec City at Bishop Mountain School. Today, it happens to be the headquarters for the Central Quebec School Board. But quickly, my parents moved me to St. Stephen's Elementary School, which was closer to the home, and I did my first and second grades there. Following that, we moved to Sherbrooke, Quebec, where I attended St. Pat's High School, completed my elementary school, and did my first 3 years of high school. Once again, the family chose to move towards Montreal, and we settled in Otterburn Park, which is just along the banks of the Richelieu River, where I completed my high school at Macdonald-Cartier. My post-secondary school is quite varied. I played quite a bit of hockey, and I was privileged to be awarded a scholarship. My scholarship brought me down to the Ivy League school, the University of Pennsylvania, where I graduated in international relations and economics. Upon returning to Montreal, I began a career with Gulf Oil, but only lasted 2 years. I saw Gulf Oil as being everything that I didn't want to do with my life, and I quickly returned to school. I completed a teaching diploma at McGill University. I also went back to school, completed a second undergraduate degree at Concordia University in Canadian Studies. And I later did a master's in education at McGill University. So that pretty well rounds up my formal education.
Okay, and what is or was your occupation?
I'd like to say I was and always remain a teacher. I taught for 9 years at our largest English high school in Greenfield Park, Centennial Regional High School. I was a vice principal there for 4.5 years, but I later moved on towards the board where I became the assistant to the director in human resources. An opportunity presented itself in Montreal with the Protestant School Boards Association. They were looking for a negotiator at the time at the teacher table and the professional non-educator teacher table. And I moved from the school board to working with Quebec's provincial school board's body. After about 18 months, I received notice that a position was available to assume the responsibilities as Director of Labor Relations for, at that time, the Protestant school boards in Quebec. I took on that challenge and I remained there for approximately 20 years. But I do like to highlight that I consider my greatest accomplishment the transfer from confessional school boards to linguistic school boards in '98 with the then Parti Québécois at the time. And I completed my career as the Director of Labor Relations for English language school boards.
Okay, and where do you live now, Ben?
I live in St. Lambert on the South Shore.
Okay, very good. Now, the following questions are more to the meat of the matter, if you will. So we're going to start off with, it's interesting. People have trouble with this. Other people don't. It's a very broad question, but I will ask it as is and let you respond in any way you see fit. What is the best thing about living in Quebec?
Friends.
Excellent. Okay.
Absolutely.
And describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
Complicated.
And where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
Dave, I'd have to say it's a combination of both. It's a combination of friendship and a combination of geography. I see home and I feel at home anywhere between the banks of the St. Lawrence River on the South Shore, as far as Sherbrooke and including the eastern townships. To this day, I still call this home, and I still have a lot of friends from the banks of the St. Lawrence here in St. Lambert, Brossard, Greenfield Park, as far out as Sherbrooke and including the townships. Yeah, definitely home.
Okay. Now, the next question is a two-part question, and I'm going to let you know that the second part of the question has sometimes resulted in people asking me, well, what do you mean by the official definition of Quebec? And I answer that by saying it can be whatever you perceive to be the official definition of Quebec. In other words, it can be the government definition. It can be the definition as framed by your peers, whatever you perceive to be the official definition of Quebec. So that is my description of that part of the question. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you both parts. So I'll start with, how would you define how would you define a Quebecer or Quebecois? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Okay, you're absolutely right, Dave. We're starting to get into the meat of the matter, and answers aren't as easily forthcoming. I'd have to say that first and foremost, I'm comfortable with a definition of Quebec's geographic borders. So anyone residing within that area or someone speaking of Quebec, one has to reflect on the geography of Quebec. What makes you a Quebecer? First and foremost, birth, but not necessarily birth, because a lot of people were born here but never lived here. And consequently, their only affinity or their only relationship to this place, to this province, is on paper. I was born in Montreal, Sherbrooke, Quebec City, wherever. That's it, that's all. But my second definition of a person who is a Québécois would be a person who lives here, resides here by choice. So you have the two, those people who are born here and reside here by choice, and those people who have moved here and reside here by choice.
Very good. That brings us to the next question. Has your identity, sense of identity as a Quebecer or Quebecois changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
Yes, it has. It's changed tremendously. I would have to say that today, my sense of identity has become more politicized. Let me explain. Today, provincially, I feel polarized. I feel sometimes excluded. Nationally, I'm always on the defensive when I travel. Oh, you're from Quebec. Oh, then the discussions begin. What do you think about the language laws? What do you think about Legault? What did you think about Lévesque? Why didn't you leave? I'm constantly on the defensive. Internationally, I'm always correcting people. Non, je ne suis pas québécois, je suis canadien qui demeure et habite au Québec. And I find that that has become almost a repetitive mantra in the three distinctions. Here at home, nationally, and internationally.
And what are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec at this time?
I have to say, is reconciling my presence here with sometimes the overwhelming criticism that I, as a member of the English language community, receives on a regular basis. I find that it is unjust, it is belittling, and it is completely inaccurate. I think that there is absolutely no recognition on the part of the media, on the part of the politicians, of the strides and the efforts that Anglo-Quebecers have made to become a part of this community. And the litmus test for that is a reflection of our numbers in the schools. All one has to do is look at how many of our children, our nieces, our nephews, our grandchildren have transitioned from a purely English educational environment to a bilingual immersion environment. And today we're seeing our school numbers diminish as they move towards these immersion classes, and we are left with basically children with special needs or learning difficulties who are housed in the English community because they haven't the ability to transition to French schools and learn a second language simultaneously. And those efforts we have made aren't recognized. We are constantly targeted as being the guilty ones, the reflection back to that little old lady in Eaton's who wouldn't serve her clientele in French. That's past. That's not us. That may have been our grandfathers or our parents, but it is not us.
Okay, now some of these questions, as I'm sure you've noted, have already been answered in some of the other questions that you've responded to, but I want to make sure I get a response to each question on record. So at the risk of being repetitive, I'm going to ask the next question, which I think you answered in your previous question, but I will ask it anyway. In recent years, Quebec's Francophone majority has identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
Well, I'll begin by saying that figures lie and liars figure. That said, there is a perception amongst many Francophones that their cultural identity and their language is under assault. I have trouble many times reconciling that perception or those assertions with reality. I'll tell you a little story. I remember during my years as a negotiator or the president of the negotiating committee, walking on St. Catherine Street with a negotiator from the Quebec government. And the person had the perception that everybody on St. Catherine Street only spoke English. At the end of the walk, the person turned to me and said, you know, our problem is not really English. Our problem is every other language. I'm not hearing English, but I'm not hearing French, but it's every other language. So there is a concern that has to be appreciated. There is a fear that must be taken into account, but it's not at the expense of the English community that you have to solve the problem. We should be perceived as partners in the efforts to maintain and to protect the identity and the uniqueness of this place. And we're not. So to say exactly what are those elements that scare me, that I dislike, it's the repetition of false information that we are the problem. We are not the problem. We are part of the solution.
Okay, that leads me to the next question, and it's another very large question, and I'll let you answer as you see fit. What, in your experience, is the biggest problem facing Quebec, and how, in your experience, do you think it could be resolved?
Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit on this, Dave, and I'm going to give you an answer that comes from a discussion with my wife, who's second generation Canadian. Her parents, or pardon me, her grandparents are from London, England. She's learned French. It's been difficult, but she's learned French, and we've had the discussion and we've talked about it. And she said, Ben, it's one thing to learn a language, but it's another thing to learn a culture. We may make strides in forcing people to learn French, but you can't force people to appreciate a culture. I think Quebec's biggest problem is through immigration. And I'm not against immigration. I believe that economically, in order to sustain ourselves, we need to open our doors. But to be so naive to think that because a person speaks French, they're going to embrace your culture, it's not true. People have to feel a kinship, have to feel a warmth, a want to be part of something. The means by which this government is forcing its new legislation is alienating. It's not embracing. There's no compassion in this exercise. It's an exercise of numbers. It's an exercise of beating a drum and looking for bad people.
Very good. Now, the next question, you may have looked at it and wondered why we framed it this way. And I'll give you a little background before I actually answer it. I don't know if you've seen Guy Rogers' great documentary, What We Choose to Remember, about Quebec.
No, I've not.
Okay, if you have not, I will send you the link. The link, when you open it up, will play this documentary. It is, in my modest estimation, one of the great works of exposing the inaccuracies and the truths of English Quebec through waves of immigration and historical perspective. It has inspired me. It has inspired this project that I'm working on. And the reason I mentioned that is, in this documentary, what I learned was he used this visual tool, a show of fingers, very effectively with a group that he interviewed. So having said all of that, I'd like you, by a show of fingers, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges?
I got 6.
Very good. I truly appreciate that. Now, lastly, is there anything else, anything at all, that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec?
Over the course of my 20 years working for the Protestant and later the English school boards in Quebec City, I must say honestly, I have never, ever experienced any discrimination that was levied either at myself as an Anglophone or at our community. I don't understand that of late things have taken a turn in a negative direction. I understand that politicians do things for the benefit of being reelected. But what's happening here in Quebec has been very divisive and very hurtful. I sometimes feel unwanted. I sometimes feel threatened in terms of my right to live as an Anglo-Quebecer here in this province and maintain my constitutional rights. Because I look introspectively and I see what happens in Quebec, and then I look nationally and I say, no one is defending me. I pay taxes provincially, I pay taxes federally. What is it? Is this a plan to have us either totally assimilate or get out and stop complaining on the part of the federal Liberals? I understand François Legault. I've met him as Minister of Education. I've met him personally. But what he is doing to us in order to preserve a majority has been to the detriment of our reputation as a province. This once was a very welcoming, a very inclusive province. I don't feel that way anymore. And I feel that we today are the easy target. And if this behavior continues, tomorrow it will be some other cultural community that will become the new target, because we will be no more.
Very good, Ben. Thank you so much for your truly elucidating insight. I thank you very much. I'm going to turn off the recording and we can continue to chat. Okay.